Good evening, and welcome to the Democracy Series, hosted by the University of Chicago Center for Effective Government. My name is Sadia Sindhu, and I'm the Executive Director of CEG. We're proud to host tonight's event alongside the Chicago Center on Democracy and the Seminary Co-op Bookstores. At the Center for Effective Government, we bring together scholars and practitioners to hold robust discussions and generate ideas about how we can strengthen democratic institutions in service of a more effective government. In this installment of this book series, we're speaking with author Deva Woodly on her book, Reckoning: Black Lives Matter and the Democratic Necessity of Social Movements. You'll have the opportunity today to hear Dr. Woodly speak about various aspects of her book, and we'll save about 15 minutes at the end for audience questions. Please feel free to use our Zoom Q&A function if you have any questions. Tonight's conversations will be recorded and will be shared via Twitter at UChicagoCEG. If you enjoy the conversation today, which is I suspect you will, I encourage you to attend future Democracy Series events where we will continue to explore the state of our democracy. President Barack Obama famously said that the purpose of social movements is to get a seat at the table. However, as Dr. Woodly argues in Reckoning, a sweeping account of the meaning and purpose of the movement for Black lives, the value of such movements is something much more profound. They are necessary for the health and survival of democracy. We're eager to see where tonight's conversation leads us. And with that, I'm thrilled to turn things over to Harris student Grace Oxley, who will introduce our event participants. Grace is a second-year MPP student and president of the Black Action in Public Policy Studies, or BAPS. She's also a 2021 Obama Scholar who's focusing on combating education inequality and technology access in urban areas through research and inclusive policy advocacy and implementation. Grace, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Good evening. I'm honored to introduce Dr. Deva Woodly. Dr. Woodly is an associate professor of politics at the New School, and she is also the author of Politics of Common Sense: How Social Movements Use Public Discourse to Change Politics and Win Acceptance. She has had fellowships at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, as well as the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard. Her research covers a variety of topics from media and communications to political understandings of economics to race and imagination and social movements. In each case, Dr. Woodly focuses on the impacts of public discourse on the political meanings of social and economic issues, as well as how those common understandings change democratic practice and public policy. In all cases, she centers her perspective of ordinary citizens and political challengers with the eye towards how the demos impacts political action and shapes political possibilities. Our moderator this evening is the director of the Center for Effective Government, Professor Will Howell. In addition to his role as CEG's director, Professor Howell is the Sidney Stein Professor of American Politics at the University of Chicago, with appointments at the Harris School of Public Policy, the college, and the Political Science Department, where he serves as chairs. He also is a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences and the host of Not Another Politics podcast. Professor Howell is an expert on the separation of powers and American political institutions. Professor Howell, please take it away.
Thank you, Grace. And Deva, I'm so glad that we're getting to reconnect. You know, I think I first met you, I think it was like 5 years ago. And we were at a conference, and I thought, I need to get to know Deva and learn from Deva. And then this pandemic came along, and it felt like it just opened up a lot of space and distance. And then you came out with this book, and what a treat it is to finally reconnect and to be able to talk with you about it. It's a terrifically rich and thoughtful and engaging and deep piece of scholarship. And I'm hoping we can unpack it together. And then we'll invite our audience to weigh in with questions of their own. And I think a place to start maybe is not actually with the movement for Black Lives. We're going to get there, but with social movements more broadly, because you have a lot to say about their role in democracy, and in particular, the centrality of social movements in combating what you call a politics of despair, which is essential to the maintenance of democracy. So if we want to think about the health and well-being of democracy, we better get invested in social movements. What are these politics of despair, and why are social movements broadly essential to combating them?
Yes. So let me just say that broadly, I'm a scholar of social movements. So, my first book is also about social movements and examines the living wage and marriage equality movements. So I have been long interested in the role of social movements in democracy and have been long thought that we need to really think more carefully about how we characterize social movements. I don't think that social movements are merely a sort of reaction to grievances, right? Grievances are ever present. Instead, social movements perform a special function in democracy of basically repoliticizing public life. That's what Iris Marion Young called it, right? Repoliticizing public life. And that's basically, the fact is that large institutions of whatever kind tend toward non-responsiveness and oligarchy over time, right? That's Weber's kind of iron cage. That includes democratic institutions. So the thing that calls democratic institutions back to themselves is the demand from outside those institutions that they remain representative, that they remain in touch with the authority that they have merely borrowed from the demos. And social movements are the political formation that makes that real. And so I wanted to really sort of theorize quite directly this notion of social movements as a kind of fifth estate that are required for democracies to remain democracies and not devolve into oligarchies.
So is the notion that institutions become calcified and distant and sterile, and what social movements do is breathe life into our politics and expand our imaginations. There's a kind of generative quality to them that
Yes.
democracy and democratic institutions left to their own will not endure. And for that, we need social movements.
That's right. I mean, and the thing is that democracy, in terms of representative democracy with its periodic elections, is sort of built with the notion in mind, right, that there will need to be sort of new authorization periodically in order for a democracy to remain itself, right, to remain its name. But those kind of periodic elections are not enough, because we know about institutions that they become self-serving rather than mission-serving over time, no matter how well designed that they are, right? And this we know about office holders as well, right? We can kind of go back to Mayhew, right? Single-minded seekers of re-election. The reason that you have people who are in their 80s and 90s who refuse to stop running for Congress, you know what I mean? So there are, it's not sensible, but it is in the nature of institutions and the people who populate those institutions that they become self-serving and self-focused over time instead of mission-serving and mission-focused over time. And that's a death knell for democracy. So democracies, right, require that their populations remain or become, right, attentive to their duty towards self-governance. And that's what social movements do, right? Social movements remind people, not only the people who are involved in social movements, but everyone around, right? Everyone watching. They remind people that they have a role to play in the collective self-governance that is democracy. And that's what the repoliticization of public life is about. So you can have procedures and you can have institutions that are technically democratic, but if they do not have people who understand themselves to have a role and feel efficacious about their role in co-governing, then you do not have a democracy that will function.
And that role goes beyond simply choosing between candidates every 2-4 years. It is about, and that role too is more than just getting clarity about one's own policy positions. I think you have something much broader in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the thing is that, being a democratic citizen is, in a way, being a world builder, right? So it's not just about sort of what is on offer in a particular moment. It's also about imagining the kind of society that you want to live in, right? Imagining the kinds of duties and responsibilities and the distribution thereof that you think is adequate, appropriate, relevant to the political time that you happen to be in. And that is the duty and the responsibility and the privilege, right? The kind of exciting part of being a democratic citizen. So it goes much beyond sort of choosing between options on the menu. It's also about designing the menu. And social movements are the thing that help us to first of all, they design menus, which is wonderful, but they also help us all to remember that that is part of our purview as members of the polity.
And they work on lots of registers. Let me highlight two that I saw in your book. One is at the level of kind of imagination and reimagination of what's possible. It is thinking expansively and anew on the one hand. And on the other hand, though, it's also being very grounded. It's being grounded in present realities, in present community. And there's a pragmatic quality to it. And this will be sort of a bridge to our discussion of Black Lives Matter. But it's not utopian thinking about abstractions from afar. And the invitation for the social movement is one to sort of go out into the desert and, think about some other space. It's about coming together with actual people living actual lives in participating in this work of reimagination.
Yes. Well, I mean, that's one of the major aspects of radical Black feminist pragmatism, which is a part of the political philosophy of the Black Lives Matter movement. Yes, it is pragmatic in the philosophical sense, right? Sort of in the tradition of American pragmatism. I don't mean pragmatic in terms of like, political triangulation and calculation, because then that is firmly rooted in a lack of imagination, right? Sort of trying to triangulate among possibilities that exist at this moment or that you perceive exist at this moment. The kind of pragmatic imagination and action that I'm talking about is really thinking about, okay, what are the things that we think that a just polity, a polity that actually serves the people who live in it, would be like, would require? Okay, now how do we get from here to there, right? Now, that is the pragmatic part. It's not about a kind of limit to what is possible. Instead, it's about the really quite practical work of building a bridge, right? Making a map from here to there.
Okay, so you highlighted it for us, and I'm hoping we can linger on this for a bit, and you can unpack it for us. This notion of what you call radical Black feminist pragmatism as being at the heart of the movement for Black lives, which is more than just a social movement in the sense that it has an agenda or a worldview, and it's trying to lift it up. It's rethinking in really deep ways, like what leadership is, what change actually looks like, what are the networks and structures that support change and that resist co-optation, that is at once expansive in its thinking, but also grounded. It's confronting a lot of challenges that social movements confront. So can you unpack it for us a bit, this notion of radical Black feminist pragmatism? One way to do it possibly is to take each word at a time. In what way is it radical? In what ways is it linked to the lives of Black Americans and Black folk more broadly? And you can go right on down the line.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, I chose this phrase. I should say that radical Black feminist pragmatism is the name that I have given to a political philosophy that I encountered. It's not something that I sort of made up or dreamed up. I should say that this book is empirically based. So it started with interviews with people in movement in different organizations at different levels of participation and leadership. And the thing is that when I wrote this book, I was really thinking that I was going to write like kind of a little brief book about the organization of the movement, right? Which is very unique, right? So the way that the movement is organized is quite unique. It's this semi-federated table structure where sort of people, there are tables like a policy table, an organizing table, media and communications table, healing justice table, other kinds of tables. And representatives from organizations who are affiliated with the movement come together, share information, and make decisions on movement-wide campaigns. And they do this through a kind of deliberative process. So I thought this was a very interesting kind of organizational structure that kind of solved the problem of the divide between, traditional social movements that are hierarchical and, rooted in a single organization and had sort of one agenda, and the notion of new social movements that are horizontal and loose and, and where sort of no one is in charge or that operate by consensus. Instead, this is a kind of a model that takes the best from each one of these models and tries to avoid the worst downsides to each one. So I was just going to write a little brief on that. But as I was interviewing people, they kept telling me these same principles sort of over and over again in different organizations, right? There was no pamphlet they were reading from, but they kept articulating the same things. And I was like, well, I'd better write this down. And at the end of kind of recording this, I thought, well, how do I describe this political philosophy that's so pervasive in the movement? And so I chose radical as to indicate a mode of questioning. And radical here is meant in the kind of in the way of the Latin root radix, right? And radix is just the root. This is a mode of questioning that acts to get to the root of the problem. This is avoiding the kind of given in the sort of policy environment. So instead of sort of starting with, with the problem of, for example, public safety, instead of starting with the policies that are on the table, right, that are thought to be achievable right now at this moment, a radical approach says, well, hold on, let's get to the root of what makes people unsafe. And from the root of what makes people unsafe, which seems to be instability, right? Which seems to be economic instability, it seems to be insecurity in a variety of different ways, in terms of health, in terms of neighborhood, in terms of public investment, et cetera. Then why don't we think about how to make people safe in a different way, right? That's radical, okay? It's not meant to sort of connote a particular set of policy ideas, right? It's just a mode of questioning that says, hold on, wait a minute, what's at the root of this issue? Okay, Black feminism is a legacy of political thought, often in Black American political thought, and it is the sort of ethical system of this political philosophy. And Black feminism is basically known for thinking through epistemology from lived experience, as an epistemology of sort of lived experience, and in problem solving from margin to center. That is, taking into account people who suffer at the intersection of many different sort of systems of oppression and domination, and trying to reason about how to undo those systems from the perspective of those who are most impacted by those systems, right? So it's a kind of ethical system that provides a way of reasoning, right? Once you have sort of this mode of questioning that is radical. And then pragmatism is a means of judgment, right? Pragmatism is a means of judgment. And pragmatism here is a means of judgment which basically takes seriously the idea that we have to take seriously what we mean when we say, justice, when we are asking what's true, when we are counting what is progress, right? We have to be clear that once we determine those meanings collectively, that we have to experiment with different ways of trying to achieve those things that we say that we want, that we're going to have iterations, right? That we'll have to try again and again, right? To sort of get it right. And that it's okay to do that, right? That those things are expected. So this pragmatic thought is a kind of mode of judgment that helps us to, while using the ethical system and the mode of questioning, it helps us to understand what kinds of what kinds of paths we can build from here to wherever it is we want to be. So that's what radical Black feminist pragmatism is and means. It's a mode of questioning an ethical system and a means of judgment.
You underscore the need to try and try again, and the role of experimentation, and that this quality that on the one hand there's an attention to what's high and what's possible, but also ensuring that our feet are on the ground, and it isn't just that our feet are on the ground and we recognize one another, but that we actually center those people who are most marginalized. I'm wondering, when it comes to the practice of experimentation and seeing what worked and what didn't work, what does that actually look like? So how do you know that something that you try out actually succeeded, and succeeded by what terms? And what does that look like? And are there in the work of those people who are working within the movement for Black Lives, when disagreements surface about whether or not something succeeded or failed, how is that sorted through?
I muted myself. I didn't mean to do that. Through many, many discussions. And let me just say, right, that I am not privy to all of the discussions that happen in movement about which kinds of things have decided to be are succeeding and which are failing, or which haven't succeeded yet. I mean, these are ongoing discussions that happen all the time, and there's a very vigorous discussion happening right now regarding, for example, electoral politics. So that is something that's not a kind of definite, right? I think that people bring arguments and evidence, but yes, I mean, the question does have to hinge on how has this impacted, right, people who are suffering most, right? So that's also a question about not just sort of people in leadership roles in movement, but also, people in our communities, right? Like, what are people saying about what would impact them the most? What would be most helpful? How the work needs to be directed, right, in order to be working from margin to center. And that's always an ongoing conversation. But the kinds of evidence that one does bring is actual, data about really like data about what's going on in different communities and what kinds of impacts different campaigns have had. So for example, one of the most successful ongoing campaigns of the movement is the Mama's Day bailout, which is one of many sort of bail fund actions, which have all expanded during the course of the movement's life, which gets people who are being held in pretrial detention merely because they don't have enough money to pay bail out of prison, right? So hundreds of people have been sort of freed through these actions and are freed every year. In addition to the most successful electoral campaigns that have had impacts on people's lives, have been the impact on DA's races that the movement has had. And in more than 100 cases all over the country, movement-backed candidates, or at least candidates who ran against those that the movement wanted out of office, right, have, won and are now deciding sentencing in really different ways than were possible 6 or 7 years ago. And indeed, the sort of tough on crime rhetoric that's really trying to sort of, people are, there's media narratives about its sort of reemergence, right? But in DA's races, we haven't actually seen people preferring, quote, tough on crime candidates over reform prosecutors, or those who call themselves reform prosecutors, and promise to decarceralize. So, and And those kinds of things are measurable, right? And folks in movement can actually sort of hold people accountable. District attorneys like, for example, Kim Foxx in Chicago, yeah, right, where you are, and their records, right, like Larry Krasner in Philadelphia, and have arrest rates actually gone down, have sentences actually decreased. Our stops actually, by police actually decreasing. So that kind of stuff is what's brought to the table, but also the way that people sort of, talk in their organizations, in their communities. That is how these policies are evaluated. And one of the sort of stickiest issues that folks are dealing with right now is that a lot of energy and money from movement was put into various 2020 electoral campaigns, right, and races at the national and also at the state level. And there's a lot of contention as to whether or not that was a useful use of resources.
It's interesting. I mean, that's putting the work of movements it's channeling it into standard electoral politics. It's finding preferred candidates, backing them. So how do we think, can you disentangle those two for us? Presumably it's not just about endorsements, right? It's something.
Oh no, yeah. Oh no. It was about organizing, right? Like it was like, movement specialty is organizing. And I don't mean to reduce movement work to that, right? Bail actions and direct service in various ways, organizing around, for example, in New York City, No New Jails was a campaign to try to stop the building of new prisons in New York City. There's a bunch of housing stuff that's happening, for example, in Louisville, Kentucky, where movement has like bought houses that they renovate and have given away to single Black moms. So I don't mean to at all reduce. I would be in a huge amount of trouble if I did that. No, I don't mean to reduce the vast amount of movement work to electoral politics, but a significant amount of effort was put into electoral politics in 2020. That wasn't about endorsing candidates per se, but it really was about like organizing, Black folks, and especially Black folks who don't vote often, to go to the polls. And that, it's unclear whether that was the best use of resources.
Mm-hmm. 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 How do we think about another kind of challenge that, when centering the welfare and well-being of people who are most marginalized, between, on the one hand, a set of investments that will meet needs now? These are people who are living precarious lives, who have needs now, who can't wait for something that's going to be true 5-10 years out, maybe, on the one hand. But on the other hand, wanting to make deep investments so that we're not just accepting as given a set of institutional arrangements that perpetuate the precarity. So that therein lies, it's the same, how to divide a dollar. On the one hand, meeting a present need, and on the other hand, no, I'm going to take some of that dollar and I'm going to fight those institutions, which isn't going to meet your present need now, but hopefully will meet those of your children.
Yeah, the thing is that there are enough organizations to do it, and the organizational structure is actually such that it allows for people to be working in a bunch of different domains. However, this question of how to divide the dollar itself, that is the issue, right? Because of the organizational form, there are organizations that do direct service, right? There's like Sister Song, that is, serving Black maternal health needs, right? Like there are direct service organizations, at the same time that there are organizations that are more interested in sort of electoral justice, right? So all of that is already happening. Where the contention comes in is, how do you divide resources among those organizations? And that is a difficult circle to square, right? And that is a point of contention. And indeed, it's the biggest point of contention, I think in movement.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Say a bit about, I'd like to tie this particular characterization of radical Black feminist pragmatism which is as you point out, a kind of, is it the ideology of, is a set of convictions, a set of belief systems that hold together and set into motion the work of the movement for Black lives. How tie that back to health of democracy, right? So, right, the movement Black Lives isn't just a movement, and it isn't just a generic movement with a set of objectives. It's structured in this way. Are there particular features of its design that speak to those concerns about the politics of despair and how we push back against them?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that's most important about the political philosophy of the movement is that it, as one of the features of radical Black feminist pragmatism is a politics of care. And this politics of care is not a sort of like a paternalistic or altruistic politics of care. Instead, it's this notion that really comes from the ethical system of Black feminists, of Black feminism, that, all in order to live in a healthy society, right, we also need to be healthy human beings. And in order to, understand what justice is, we need to understand what it means to live healthy and flourishing lives, right? It's not just a cognitive thing. It's not just about having good laws, right? It's not, it's about really taking into account whole people. And so in thinking about politics, and particularly democratic politics, we have to think about how it is that we not only make room for, but make characteristic of our political action, taking into account whole human beings who have capabilities that we should create conditions that they're able to exercise them and that people are able to thrive and flourish. So this politics of care is a sort of different way of thinking about what the purpose of politics is. It's not merely to sort of like win policy. It's actually to try to create conditions under which we can all flourish and thrive. And the sort of theory of the movement, right? The philosophy of the movement is that in order to do that, that's the reason to reason from margin to center, right? It's not only, it's not because of a kind of abstract reason. It's this notion that our systems of oppression, right? Like, so, meaning, white supremacy, meaning the current manifestation of capitalism, meaning patriarchy, these systems of oppression and the ways that they interlock have created these tight snarls, right? In terms of injustice, right? They're like tight knots, snarls of injustice that seem to have grown bigger and bigger and more snarled over the last, 150 years. And the notion of reasoning from margin to center is that just like with a sort of knot that you want to untie, you have to find the right place to tug. And if you don't tug in the right place, then you make the knot tighter, right? And more snarled and less likely to be untangled. So the notion of reasoning from margin to center is that's how you find where to tug. That's where you find where to tug the knot so that you can unsnarl it. And in order to do that, you really have to have this kind of expansive sort of notion of a politics of care, which says that you have to listen to people who are most impacted by systems of oppression, right, including the incarcerated, right, and to understand how these systems have impacted their lives and their communities in ways that might not be visible from a kind of bird's eye view, right? And so I think that that's what's so important about this perspective, because it's now you hear the term, which I actually hadn't heard very much before, standpoint theory, which is something that I actually quite don't like. I don't know what that is. I'm not sure.
I don't either.
Yeah, I don't know. People like theorists have started. So, and I think that people, pardon me, have started using this as a term to sort of refer to theories that begin reasoning from lived experience or inductively rather than deductively. But the thing about, reasoning this way, inductively rather than deductively, from people's lived experience, to more generalizable notions, is that it's actually it's empirical, right? It's a way of taking into account the lives that people actually live and sort of trying to solve problems from that perspective. It's not a kind of narrow viewpoint that's only sort of trying to solve the problems in one life. It's just a place where you start reasoning from. And you start reasoning from a reality of impacts instead of from a kind of theory of what ought to be or what ought to happen or how history should move.
So if we think about the work that the movement is doing, and we want to evaluate its impacts, its how it's reshaping our politics and pressing back against these politics of despair, and the movement, just as it is calling upon us to listen to and engage people on the ground, it's so too is it encouraging us to think more capaciously about what change looks like. And I don't mean capaciously just in terms of like we can reimagine the institutions. The progress along the way isn't just, well, the bill that was previously only introduced to committee got a floor vote. Progress, right? It's in thinking anew about how we define problems, how we talk about problems, who we recognize as being part of community. The markers of impact are broader and deeper than simply the election of certain kinds of people or the advancement of certain kinds of policy. Is that fair to say?
It is very fair to say. And it is, okay, so it's really important to remember, especially right now in a moment of retrenchment, right? So after the summer of 2020, when we had the largest, most diverse mobilization in American history that lasted 3 months, and caused the whole sort of tenor of a political conversation to change, had people talking about systemic racism, right, as a sort of part of normal political discourse, had people really considering what constitutes public safety and whether or not police and policing were things that were sort of worth funding at the levels that they've been funded at, right? After that, there's been a incredible retrenchment of folks who want to keep things as close as possible to status quo, and even regress, right? As much as possible. And we see this in a number of different ways, and not only in terms of the moral panic of so-called, CRT, but also as the close companion sort of aggressive bills such as criminalizing protest in various ways, up to and including 2 states have made it legal to run over protesters with your car. And then in addition to those sort of direct assaults on movement, there have also been the sort of companion assaults on nearby sort of movements, right? So we see now a retrenchment of attacks on LGBTQ people. And we see, a retrenchment of attacks on women and reproductive rights. So this is, always a dynamic where there's movement and counter movement, right? Where there are sort of advances and then there are pushbacks. And right now we're in a moment where there is a really fierce push back, right? And so it's difficult to remember that over the last decade, this movement has sort of reshaped the way that we think about, racial justice, crime, and also sort of what we deserve. The whole discourse about self-care comes from movement, right? Like that is from the Black Lives Matter movement. The question now is, how will this sort of retrenchment be answered, right? how will people remain and become mobilized in order to sort of like answer these, attempts to intimidate and capture, right, policy and institutions in such a way that the memory of this moment of progress is sort of squashed, right? And that remains to be seen. But I'm actually relatively hopeful because one of the things that this movement has done is to remind us of the power of organizing. That's really, really important because it's not just about what policies that one wins in a particular moment, from one election cycle to the next. It's also about how we learn how to organize with ourselves and each other in our communities, how we learn to sort of build the bench and take power at a variety of different levels that really decides what will be the enduring change, right? Sort of along the way. I mean, that's one of the things that we forget. And one of the things that I recount in my book is that, many people in American politics sort of wonder how it is that the far right now, right, has captured the Republican Party, right, more or less, right, in this moment. And that was a very long sort of project that was about organizing and taking power at a variety of different levels over decades, right, over decades. That is a kind of, process that I think that people, in other parts of the polity who come from different kinds of sort of political traditions may have forgotten the power of that, right? That it can't all be handled at the executive level. It won't all be handled by the courts. It really is about your school boards, your city councils, your mayor's offices, right? And that kind of organizing, your DAs, right? That kind of organizing is going on right now. And we do see pretty robust results at local levels. And it really is about raising the next generation and becoming, right, the next generation of power holders and folks who will lead.
I'm hoping we linger on this for just a bit longer, and then we're going to turn to some questions that are already coming forward. Because to my mind, there isn't just resistance; it's actually counter mobilization. So there's been a lot of mobilization on the right and a lot of work reconstituting the Republican Party. But as you alluded to earlier, the work of counter mobilization doesn't just kind of work in parallel or at cross purposes. It draws upon the work of the Movement for Black Lives and sort of refracts it. It says this is what you call the moral panic associated with critical race theory, and this plays out in a number of different ways. Defund the police. These kinds of things are used as central planks for people who are running for all kinds of office and are great ways of raising money. And it's therefore in opposition to the gains made on one side that the other side can find not just purpose, but actual traction. And I wonder, I guess my question for you is, what then is the Movement for Black Lives to do? Should they then say, if we say this, here's going to be the counter, right? And that's going to create this kind of problem. And then we get into the politics of triangulation, which you referred to at the top. Like, that's not what we're in the business of doing. And yet progress, deep long-term progress, is a function not just of what one side said, but what the demos more broadly comes around to. Mm-hmm. How do we think this through?
I think you have to go straight at it. I think that people have to stop being afraid of making the arguments that they want to make. I mean, I think that, here's the thing about counter mobilization is that, part of the reason that it works is that the current power holders in the Democratic Party are always afraid, right? They're always running scared, but they won't always be the power holders, right? They literally cannot survive to be the power holders for that much longer. So I think that it's really important to make arguments that you mean, because they're actually quite persuasive. So, for example, on the question of defund the police, if you pull on the phrase defund the police, right? People don't like it, they don't want it, and then you poll about whether or not some money should be diverted, whether or not, for example, and these are all actual what defunding the police means. You should have unarmed social workers who are trained with mental health crises to handle mental health calls to 911 instead of armed police. People are like, yeah, that is absolutely what we should do. And if you say, should you fund, if you have to choose between increasing funding for police or increasing funding for libraries in your community, or would you cut funding to the library to fund police? People are like, no, I don't want to do that, right? Like, so you actually pull the policies and people are actually quite okay with defunding the police, but very afraid of the phrase. So the question is it becomes an educative sort of process. Also, I should say, in the time of polling on defund the police, it is still very much not popular, but it's more popular now than it was last year. So this is the thing. You have to make the arguments you want to make and continue to articulate the reasons why. Because if it were the case that you could never say anything controversial, we would never have said Black Lives Matter. That was a hugely controversial name for a movement when it emerged in 2014. And everybody was like, no, we should be talking about all lives matter, and try to reinforce this sort of argument around colorblindness. And movement folks were like, no, what we mean is Black Lives Matter. That's what we mean. And we're saying that because if we don't say that, then we cannot draw attention to this particular and unjust deprivation that is on the basis of race. And there was a whole sort of education process, right, that happened in public discourse about that, that diffused from people beyond people in movement, so that people were making that argument to each other, right? Outside people who had never been in a movement organization, who hadn't been to a protest, were online making TikToks, right, about why this was the phrase. So that's, I think, what really has to happen, is that people just have to make the arguments that they need to make for the world that they wish to see, because it's actually a very appealing vision, which we've already sort of, seen. And it's okay if, power holders at the national level are unhappy with it, right? And they're really afraid that it will cost them some kind of short-term gain, because the truth is that they're not doing that well holding their short-term gains anyway. It's up to people who are organized and who have an expansive vision, people in the movement for Black Lives, but also in other movements, right? Other folks who are interested in building a different kind of 21st century. It's up to those people, and it's up to us, right, to bring forward those arguments into this new century, into this new era. And I really do sort of believe that in a quite deep way. I mean, I just think about, the political actors. What were people doing in politics 100 years ago this time, right? Were they sort of kowtowing to the people who had taken office in 1872? No.
Somewhere. Somewhere.
Right. Some were, but they were not, they were not on that was not the good strategy, right? That is not the strategy that gave the 20th century its sort of distinction and the progress that it made. And so now we're in a new century, and it's time to have a different vision. And it's time for us to decide that where we're going in this century is different than where we have been, and to not make any apologies about it.
Helen Mills asks, Helen Mills is not an author. She's here with us. She's asking you a question. Can you speak a bit about the change in how we look at voting from the old school, just focused on candidates, to now focus on voters' power to make the change? Focusing on the voters' power is a huge shift, right? I think this speaks in no small part to your conceptualization, not just of the change that's possible, but how we look at what it means to be an individual who's engaged in democratic politics. It's somebody who doesn't merely cast votes, but that is what?
But that is also involved in the creation of the field of political possibility, right? So that means that it's not just about who you choose at a particular time. It's also about how involved you are, and whether you yourself, right, are the kind of person who is going to be shaping policy in your locality, right? Whether or not and not just in elected office either, right? We've seen also the explosion of other kinds of civic associations that help to expand people's sort of range of knowledge, right? And skill when it comes to policymaking. So, for example, I'm thinking of like mutual aid groups here, and sort of things like this. Civic associations where people learn how to provide public goods in some way, and they learn a bunch of civic skills, right? Political skills. About how you sort of coordinate activities over a broad range. And then all of a sudden, your interaction with government, be it local or state or national, is really different because you also now have a sense of what it is, right, to coordinate activities, for service, right, over some sort of broad terrain. And what you don't know, you also feel more empowered to learn. So this is kind of a throwback to Schlossman, Verba, and Brady, right? Like kind of, money, skills, and time is that, as people participate, especially at the local level, they learn more of what's possible, and then their demands become different of power holders, and they're less likely to sort of restrict their input to only the moment of casting the vote.
Terrific. Another question. You talk about how social media has created a new and important way for this movement to proliferate. Actually, there's a quote here from your book. Communities are often created and nurtured in private, but social media communities manage to create a sense of intimacy while existing entirely in public view. And there's a reference here then to Black Twitter. Can you say a bit about the role of social media in the work of movement? And then again, how that the work of movement interacts with democracy more broadly?
Sure. I mean, social media is a communication tool, just like the other communication tool. I mean, it's different than the other communication tools that had come before it, but just as they sort of changed the political environment because they made different things possible, so too does social media, and it has its pluses and minuses. One of its pluses is that you can have these like instantaneous sharing of information. A minus is that that information might be false, right? Or or bad, right? Or impulsive or something like that. The other thing is that you can kind of create communities. That sort of quote is referring especially to the way that this social movement, but I think social movements probably from now on, are able to sort of like make connections face to face. So you make a connection at an organizational meeting or at a protest, but then you share social media information and you can sort of follow each other on social media and chat and talk to each other. And even if you live very far away from each other, you develop this deepening sense of intimacy, right? Of being friends, of knowing each other, and sort of can coordinate activity, but also their whole like discussions and cultural milieus, right, that develop on social media that can be extremely useful because at moments when mobilization then becomes useful or necessary again, these networks can be activated so that they do things in real life, right? That's the thing. I think that the whole notion of like slacktivism or, it's only online, et cetera, these notions are dated now. Everything that happens online also affects offline things. So at the same time that, Twitter is not the real world, it is also not disconnected from the real world either, right? So particularly if we're talking about political mobilization.
Mm-hmm. Deva, we're bumping up at the top of the hour, and I need to hand the microphone back to Sadia, who's just joined us. I'll say, you got your degree from our department, and we're so proud, and we want you to come back and visit us. We did this virtually this go around, but come on back to Chicago, Deva, and we'll find a chance to do it again. Sadia.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Deva, and thank you, Will, for a fascinating conversation. And thank you all for joining us for this installment of the Democracy Series. A joint initiative brings you books and authors on this critical topic. We do this in combination with the Seminary Co-op Bookstore and the Chicago Center on Democracy. Looks like Zoe's in view. Please make sure to find the Chicago Center for Effective Government on Twitter at UChicagoCEG and the Seminary Co-op at Seminary Co-op. Thank you all and have a wonderful night.
Thank you.